range of issues, including immigration and gun control. President Biden will also highlight his administration's success in tackling the coronavirus pandemic so far. CBS News' Natalie Brand has more on the president's message for today's event.
As President Biden touts progress in the coronavirus vaccine rollout, he's facing new questions about what many are calling a growing crisis at the southern border.
This new surge we're dealing with now started with the last administration, but it's our responsibility to deal with it humanely and to stop what's happening.
The president has tasked Vice President Kamala Harris to lead the administration's border response and work with Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, countries the migrants are fleeing.
If you deal with the problems in country, it benefits everyone.
The U.S. government is adding more than 16,000 emergency beds to house the influx of children. Complicating the situation, nearly 3,000 have tested positive for COVID-19.
The CDC is working really closely with the administration to ensure safe COVID practices.
The president takes the podium after 2 shooting massacres in less than a week left 18 dead, renewing a push for gun safety legislation.
If we want something to be permanent, if we want it to be lasting, we need it to be legislation. He certainly believes that, but there are also executive actions under consideration.
Despite a 50-50 split in the Senate, President Biden has said he does not support abolishing the filibuster, which would help him get more of his agenda passed, including a hotly debated voting rights bill.
A bill that would combat all of these voter suppression efforts. A bill that would make it easier, not harder, to vote.
This legislation would forcibly rewrite the election laws of all 50 states from here in Washington.
The president is also likely to face questions about international tensions, including the latest North Korean ballistic missile tests.
And joining me now is CBS News Washington reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns and CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian. Welcome to both of you. Great to see you. Caitlin, let's start with you. How has President Biden been preparing for his first news conference, and what is at stake for him today?
Hi, Tanya. Well, the White House announced this press conference several days ago, so he has had a bit of time to prepare. But in those intervening days, we've seen the headlines really change. Remember, President Biden campaigned as a candidate talking about the coronavirus pandemic and running as a referendum on the former president's handling of that pandemic. That issue had taken center stage in the early days of Biden's presidency, along with the economic fallout. So the focus had been getting COVID relief passed through Congress. But now you see many other headlines confronting this administration, namely the immigration issue and the surge of migrants at the border. That is certainly something he will be asked about in a variety of different ways later on today at this press conference, talking about or questioning what the administration's policies have had in terms of that surge. There has also been 2 mass shootings in as many weeks, which raises questions for what this administration can do on the issue of gun control and what they could pressure Congress to do. So those will be kind of 2 big issues to address at this press conference today. And there's also a big question about how the president can actually get the rest of his agenda through Congress if the Senate rules and the filibuster remains in place. So he'll likely be asked about that, and we'll see what he says and if there are any changes to his mind about that.
And Nicole, President Biden has faced some criticism for not having a news conference earlier in his presidency. Do we have any indication as to why the president has not held a press conference yet?
Well, keep in mind, for those of us who did cover the president during the campaign, he didn't hold a lot of press conferences then either, and much to the concern of a number of journalists. Certainly he did hold a number of press availabilities, but even when he did hold press conferences or took questions from the media, oftentimes it was just a handful of questions, and in many cases it was from a pre-selected group of reporters. So from that standpoint, I would say this is not necessarily unusual from what we saw during the campaign. But, what the White House argues is that, the president has been out speaking to people, regular Americans, on an everyday basis, that he has done town halls, he has done a number of interviews, he has taken questions from the press at various times, at some 40 times, according to their count. And so they believe that he has remained engaged. Of course, certainly this priority as far as getting this COVID relief bill passed was very all-consuming. So we know that has been something that the president has spent a lot of time working on. But certainly I know many reporters eager to question him now, some 60 days in, which is perhaps one of the longest stretches we've seen from an incoming president.
A lot of eagerness to question the president, for sure. Caitlin, getting back to some of what you said earlier about what we can expect to hear from the president, let's talk about gun control, because, of course, we've seen 2 terrible mass shootings recently. Is the White House prepared to tackle the issue of gun control this early in Mr. Biden's presidency?
Well, they say that they're prepared to go forward with executive action. However, they've been pretty vague about what that can mean. Some proposals include closing some background check loopholes, directing more funding to communities to combat violence. There has also been, from this administration, the pressure, though, on Congress. You've heard this from President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris yesterday, telling CBS This Morning that they want to focus on making Congress pass legislation that is obviously more definitive and has more teeth than any kind of executive action. But as we know, and as we've been covering, gun legislation on Capitol Hill is always elusive, and even more so. So there is not support for gun legislation on Capitol Hill, and that again raises the question of how the president can get his priorities passed without a supermajority in Congress and without changing the rules. When it comes to the issue of gun control, this is an issue with which President Biden is intimately familiar. When he was a senator, he was an architect of the assault weapons ban. He has called for a renewal of that ban, even though that is very unlikely to pass on Capitol Hill. When he was vice president, then President Obama tasked him with trying to shepherd legislation through Capitol Hill, through Congress after the Sandy Hook shooting. We know, obviously, that did not pass the Senate as well. So he has called for extended background checks. He's called for an assault weapons ban. Those are the issues he's been focused on. But the big question is what he can and will do, since Congress is unlikely to be able to act.
And in terms of that, what has he said about possible executive action, or what have members of his administration hinted he may be considering in terms of executive action?
In terms of executive action, there have been proposals to close some background check loopholes. There have been proposals to direct more money to communities to be able to confront violence in their communities. There's also been a proposal to potentially block the sale of these kind of homemade gun-making kits. So those are some things that they could move forward with. And gun control activists have been pressuring the administration to take some kind of action because they know how difficult it is to pass legislation on the Hill. But the White House has also been arguing that legislation has more weight and lasts longer, of course, than executive orders.
Sure. And Nicole, another thing that President Biden is facing a lot of pressure to address is the filibuster. He's already opposed a rewrite of the Senate filibuster rules, virtually blocking any new legislation Democrats introduce on gun control. How do you see the president navigating this juxtaposition in today's press conference?
Yeah, well, as Caitlin mentioned, it's more than likely expected to come up because so much legislation kind of hinges on potential changes or reform. And now in a recent interview, the president did say that he is open to this idea of a talking filibuster, and recall that when he was in the Senate, that's kind of how it used to work, that a senator would have to command the floor, and traditionally that's how we think of filibusters and how they operate. But in reality, more recently, really all it takes is one senator to express their objection through an email, really, to create this potential holdup and to require this 60-vote threshold. What the challenge is that even if there is a move maybe to just reform the filibuster and kind of move back more towards this talking format, there is not necessarily this will or political will to eliminate this 60-vote threshold. And so it is a fine line that the president will have to walk if he's asked about it today.
And Caitlin, another thing the president is expected to be asked about is immigration. Tell us what we've heard so far from President Biden about the children at the border and, in a larger context, his administration's immigration policy, because it seems as if the administration so far has struggled a little bit with clarity on that issue. It's been a little bit vague, and there have been opportunities that the administration seems to walk back on some of some of the issues that they were proposing before the election. So it seems like this is an opportunity for President Biden to really clarify his immigration policy.
That's exactly right, because this has been a growing issue for this administration. And the question has been centered around what kind of messaging they have been sending to Central American countries, particularly. On one hand, they had changed Trump administration policy on the border to offer, in their words, a more humane approach. So on one hand, they were saying that they weren't going to turn people away. They weren't going to separate children from their parents. They weren't going to send children back across the border. But on the other hand, they were trying to get the message out that now is not the time to come, because they were not prepared to house this many people at facilities at the border. And what has happened is that you have had this surge in migrants coming across. You've had this surge in children coming across, or unaccompanied minors coming across, and they've been held at Customs and Border Patrol facilities that are not designed to house children and are not designed to house them for more than 72 hours. And they have been staying beyond that limit because the facilities that are intended for them, run by HHS, are full. And so there have been a lot of issues that this administration has to address, namely the messaging, namely why they weren't prepared for this kind of surge given the change in policy. And there's also been a question about media access. Reporters have been requesting access to the Custom and Border Patrol facilities. They were granted one camera yesterday, a pool camera yesterday, at a visit to an HHS facility that was not kind of the center of attention before. So there's still questions about access to what's going on inside.
A lot of questions about immigration. Nicole, what role is Vice President Kamala Harris now playing in immigration policy? And what is Congress looking for from both the vice president and the president?
Well, according to senior administration officials and the president, she will be tasked with being the point person on this issue and this growing crisis at the border. More specifically, she will be leading the United States' effort with Mexico, as well as the Northern Triangle, which are some of those countries in Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, etc. And so, according to administration officials, she will be looking at two tracks. One, looking at trying to stem the flow of migrants coming to the United States, but also to build broader strategic relationships with these countries in order to address the root of the problem at hand. So this is something that more or less has kind of taken effect immediately. As far as members of Congress, I think to Caitlin's point earlier, it really is just about getting that basic access, seeing what's happening on the ground in these facilities. We know that there have been a number of congressional delegations that have gone down, and more that will continue to go down tomorrow, including a group led by Senators Cruz and Cornyn. Their big thing is we're trying to be the eyes and ears on the ground. You also have on the Democratic side Congressman Joaquin Castro, who will be leading a delegation tomorrow to the same facility that some members of Congress and White House officials visited yesterday. And so as part of that group, you've got mostly Democrats on that trip, including some members of the squad. Congresswoman Omar and Tlaib will be on that trip. So at this point, it really is about these members just trying to get basic questions answered in terms of, what is happening on the ground, what is going on in these facilities, and again, getting to that key issue of access.
Right. And Caitlin, one issue the president will likely be happy to talk about is the vaccine rollout and his handling of the coronavirus, which, I'm sure that he sees as a success. He has said that he wants to make the vaccine available to every American adult by May 1st. How will the president address states that are lifting mask requirements altogether that seem to be moving on their own timeline?
That's right. And when those governors started to, in Texas, for example, started to put aside those mask mandates or end those mask mandates, President Biden called it Neanderthal thinking and elicited a lot of blowback from conservative Republican governors because of that. But yes, they are wanting to tout their efforts on the vaccine, on distribution of the vaccine, and meeting the goals that they had set out for the first 100 days when it came to distribution. You have a lot of states already saying that they are likely to meet that goal by May 1st, and some even much earlier than that. But a couple areas of focus when it comes to the vaccine are going to be around the issue of reopening schools. That was also pledged by this administration. CDC released new guidelines earlier this week about social distancing guidelines within schools. You had the largest teachers union come out and say that they were concerned about that they were not convinced by that. So he'll be asked likely about his relationship with teachers unions related to the reopening of schools. We also know that this administration has been trying to address the issue of vaccine hesitancy. This has been a core message as they're traveling around the country trying to promote the relief package and get people who may be on the fence about the vaccine to sign up to get it. And there was some interesting CBS News polling out today looking at the impact of a nudge from the president or from former President Trump. And they saw that among Democrats that a nudge from President Biden does have an impact on getting some people off the fence. So that's also a related issue as well.
And Nicole, what additional hurdles does the Biden administration face in tackling the COVID-19 pandemic and reopening the economy? I mean, Caitlin just mentioned schools, which is a big one, but certainly, the economy has been more or less closed for about a year now. There's going to be some rusty wheels that need some greasing. Where are the biggest areas that will challenge the administration?
Well, you're seeing some of that happening today in the Senate, where they're taking up an extension of the PPP program, that loan program for small businesses, and likely expected to pass an extension of that. It was due to expire at the end of this month, and so by extending it, that really allows the Small Business Administration, which is administering this program, to kind of clear a backlog of applications and also continue to fund some of these businesses that are struggling. Obviously there was a lot of attention at the outset of this program that not enough money was getting to small businesses, and particularly minority-owned businesses. So the Biden administration has made that a priority, even as we see this potential extension, and can expect administration officials to kind of push that going forward. I think the other area, of course, that we've seen the Biden administration try to address is this issue not only of hesitancy, but also vaccine equity, and making sure that the vaccine is getting out to communities that need it, particularly communities of color. So we saw them announce this investment of some $10 billion, much of it money coming out of the recently passed American Rescue Plan. But in essence, this money would go towards the expansion of community health centers and really prioritizing those frontline workers, and many of whom are people of color, to try to make sure that they are getting the vaccine. So we've heard, for instance, from Congressman Clyburn on that earlier today, applauding this effort to really try to expand, this ability to get the vaccines to these communities that have been hardest hit and that at the same time are highest risk. So obviously that continues to be a space and area that we'll watch as well, that the administration continues to navigate.
Absolutely. And Caitlin, can we expect the president to field some tough questions on foreign policy today. I mean, as you know, North Korea has reportedly just tested some missiles. Like, there are a lot of areas of foreign policy that need addressing. Can we expect him to address those today?
Oh, certainly, and especially the issue of sanctions against Russia for that SolarWinds cyber attack. And this is an issue, of course, with which President Biden is very, very familiar. He was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. Foreign policy had been his kind of bread and butter, something that was a calling card for him when he was a vice presidential candidate in 2008 for Barack Obama and re-election. Earlier this year, he made a trip to the State Department with Secretary of State Tony Blinken to announce that America is quote unquote back. So that has been a key priority. And when he was forming his cabinet and executive appointments, he focused really on those positions related to national security and the State Department, building out that team as one of the first teams to build out. So certainly North Korea, certainly Russia will be game for topics of questions today.
And Nicole, can we expect to see President Biden be a bit more transparent with the public, with the press, following this news conference? He has received a little bit of criticism over that.
I think he will try to. I think anytime he speaks, whether it's in a formal setting like this, he tries to tell it like it is. That's kind of like his trademark, right? To say, look, folks, and so I think you can expect that whenever he takes questions or whenever he's in these public spaces, that he does try to shoot straight. I mean, obviously, we'll have to see how this news conference plays out, because we know sometimes in the past the president has been prone to gaffes or sometimes has to clean up some of the things that he says. But I think he tries to make a good faith effort to, answer the questions when they're posed. And so I think you'll see more of that today. I think, if anything, the big thing to watch, or certainly what we'll be watching for from the Hill, is this issue of bipartisanship, right? Because the president has made clear, going into office, that he was the type of leader who could reach across the aisle. And that's something many Republicans have pointed out here on the Hill. If you look back to what the president said at the inauguration, he said that he was going to be this president for all, and yet they feel kind of burned that the president really hasn't worked with him. And yes, he has reached out to a bipartisan group of lawmakers, for instance, on the American Rescue Plan and on issues like infrastructure. But at the end of the day, we saw with that COVID relief bill that it went through this budgetary process that only required Democratic support. And so, I think Republicans are really looking to see if the president will reach out more across the aisle than he has been doing. We know he is working on this infrastructure plan that has a pretty hefty price tag, and many Republicans have already said, for them, it's too costly and not necessarily a starter here in the Senate, somewhere in the price tag of $3 trillion. But, it is something where you wonder if the president and the White House will give a little and what it will give on. So I think that, too, is a line of questioning to watch for in this news conference.
And Caitlin, to broaden that question out a bit and look at the entire, White House press team, has the press team at large been getting high marks from White House correspondents? Are they happy with the way their questions are being fielded? Do they feel the White House in general is being responsive and transparent enough?
Well, this is a White House that brought back the daily White House briefings, and that was a point made early on in this administration. But there had been calls for the president to hold a press conference for a while now. And as Nicole mentioned earlier, that many of his predecessors, most of his predecessors, had already had a press conference by this time. What has changed is the COVID protocols. As we were covering the campaign early on in the primary process, Biden and the other candidates were very accessible, would do gaggles, it was easy to get questions and answers to them. Then when COVID hit, of course, everybody was pretty sidelined, and it made it much more difficult to get questions in, to have press conferences. And so, as Nicole mentioned, they became few and far between, and that has kind of stayed with the COVID protocol still existing as we're still in a pandemic. pandemic as this administration has gotten underway. And you can see there in your screen that this is a socially distanced press conference. Reporters are spaced out. Those protocols remain at the White House. The administration argues that the president has been out touring the country, trying to plug the COVID relief package, taking some questions here and there as he's boarding planes or at different events. He did an interview with ABC News. He did an interview earlier this year with our own Nora O'Donnell, but he hasn't had this kind of specific press conference where he is standing there taking questions on a variety of different issues facing the administration in this kind of setting. So we'll see. This is a president that has been much more disciplined in terms of messaging than certainly his predecessor, but also compared to how he has been in the past. So we'll see if that kind of message discipline continues in this press conference.
We just got the 2-minute warning, so presumably the president will be headed out soon. But Nicole, in terms of the president's next legislative priority, we know the American Rescue Plan was passed, and he's been spending time traveling around the country touting the plan. He will likely be asked about his next major legislative priority, which seems to be, by most indications, some sort of infrastructure bill. But he'll probably also be asked how he plans to get anything passed through this Senate. Is he likely to address that?
Well, I think so. I mean, the president is poised to roll out more details of his Build Back Better plan, and much of that will be a big component, will be infrastructure, and another component is expected to encompass a more social welfare type options, and measures to try to level the playing field. But as far as the infrastructure package, I mean, that is something that does have bipartisan support here on Capitol Hill. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a group of Republicans that is willing to work with the administration on this and has been meeting behind the scenes with the White House, with Secretary Buttigieg. Again, their concern is the price tag with this. If it ends up ballooning to $2 trillion, $3 trillion, they're not so sure they can support something at that level. So again, it's an issue of whether or not there's some middle ground there, whether or not the president's willing to give a little on that. And so again, that's certainly a question I expect he'll have to address.
And Caitlin, what has the president said about the lengths he's willing to go to push through other legislative priorities? We'll hold that because we want to take you now to the White House East Room, where President Biden is approaching the podium.
Before
Let's
I take
listen
questions, I want to give you a progress report to the nation on where we stand 65 days into office here, on vaccinations and a few other top priorities for the American people. First, on vaccinations. On December 8th, I indicated that I hope to get 100 million shots in people's arms in my first 100 days. We met that goal last week by day 58, 42 days ahead of schedule. Now today I'm setting a second goal, and that is we will, by my 100th day in office, have administered 200 million shots in people's arms. That's right, 200 million shots in 100 days. I know it's ambitious, twice our original goal, but no other country in the world has even come close, not even close to what we were doing. I believe we can do it. And today, we made a historic investment in reaching the hardest hit and the most vulnerable communities, the highest risk communities, as a consequence of the virus, by investing an additional $10 billion in being able to reach them. I also set a goal before I took office of getting a majority of schools in K through 8 fully open in the first 100 days. Now, thanks to the enormous amount of work done by our administration, educators, parents, local, state education officials, and leaders, recent Department of Education survey shows that nearly half of the K through 8 schools are open now full-time, 5 days a week for in-person learning. Not yet a majority, but we're really close, and I believe in the 35 days left to go, we'll meet that goal as well. As of yesterday, more than 100 million payments of $1,400 have gone into people's bank accounts. That's real money in people's pockets, bringing relief instantly almost. And millions more will be getting their money very soon. One final note. Since we passed the American Rescue Plan, we're starting to see new signs of hope in our economy. Since it was passed, a majority of economic forecasters have significantly increased their projections on the economic growth that's going to take place this year. They're now projecting it will exceed 6%, a 6% growth in GDP. And just this morning, we learned that the number of people filing for weekly unemployment insurance fell by nearly 100,000 persons. It's the first time in a year the number has fallen below the pre-pandemic high. So there are still too many Americans out of work, too many families hurting, and they still have a lot of work to do. But I can say to you, the American people, help is here and hope is on the way. Now I'll be happy to take your questions. Zeke, Associated Press.
Thank you, Mr. President. You mentioned your progress on COVID-19. I'd like to ask you about some of the other issues facing your presidency. One of the defining challenges you face in the coming months is how to deliver on your promise to Americans on issues like immigration reform, gun control, voting rights, climate change. All of those right now are facing stiff, united opposition from Republicans on Capitol Hill. How far are you willing to go to achieve those promises that you made to the American people?
Well, I'm good. Look, when I took office, I decided that it was a fairly basic, simple proposition, and that is I got elected to solve problems. And the most urgent problem facing the American people, I stated from the outset, was COVID-19 and the economic dislocation for millions and millions of Americans. And so that's why I put all my focus in the beginning. There are a lot of problems, but all my focus on dealing with those particular problems. And the other problems we're talking about, from immigration to guns and the other things you mentioned, are long-term problems. They've been around a long time. And what we're going to be able to do, God willing, is now begin one at a time to focus on those as well. And whether it's immigration or guns or a number of other problems that face the country. But the fundamental problem is getting people some peace of mind so they can go to bed at night and not stare at the ceiling wondering whether they lost their health insurance, whether they're going to lose a family member, whether they're going to be in a position where they're going to lose their home because they can't pay their mortgage, or the millions of people are going to get thrown out of their homes because of the inability to pay their rent. So we're going to move on these one at a time, try to do as many simultaneously as we can, but that's the reason why I focused as I have. And here's the deal. I think my Republican colleagues are going to have to determine whether or not we want to work together, or they'll decide that the way in which they want to proceed is to just decide to divide the country, continue the politics of division. But I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to move forward and take these things as they come.
And just to follow up, Mr. President, can your presidency be a success if you can't make progress on those four challenges: climate change, immigration reform, gun control, voting rights?
Well, I plan on making progress on all of them, but that's going to be for the American people to decide. I think, I doubt whether, maybe you did, maybe others did. I thought, many of you thought there was no possibility of my getting the plan I got passed without any Republican votes. Pretty big deal. Got passed. Growing the economy. People's lives are changing. So let's see what happens. All I know, I've been hired to solve problems, not create division. Okay, how about Yamiche?
Thanks so much, Mr. President. You've said over and over again that immigrants shouldn't come to this country right now. This isn't the time to come. That message is not being received. Instead, the perception of you that got you elected as a moral, decent man is the reason why a lot of immigrants are coming to this country and entrusting you with unaccompanied minors. How do you resolve that tension? And how are you choosing which families can stay and which can go, given the fact that even though with Title 42, there are some families that are staying? And is there a timeline for when we won't be seeing these overcrowded facilities run by CPB when it comes to unaccompanied minors?
Well, look, I guess I should be flattered. People are coming because I'm the nice guy. That's the reason why it's happening. That I'm a decent man, or however it's phrased. That, that's why they're coming, because Biden's a good guy. Truth of the matter is, nothing has changed. As many people came, 28% increase in children to the border in my administration, 31% in the last year in 2019 before the pandemic in the Trump administration. It happens every single solitary year. There is a significant increase in the number of people coming to the border in the winter months of January, February, March. It happens every year. In addition to that, there is and by the way, does anybody suggest that there was a 31% increase under Trump because he was a nice guy and he was doing good things at the border? That's not the reason they're coming. The reason they're coming is that it's the time they can travel with the least likelihood of dying on the way because of the heat in the desert, number one. Number two, they're coming because of the circumstances in country. In country. The way to deal with this problem, and I started to deal with it back when I was a United States Senator, Vice President, putting together a bipartisan plan of over $700 million to do with the root causes of why people are leaving. What did Trump do? He eliminated that funding. He didn't use it. He didn't do it. And in addition to that, what he did, he dismantled all the elements that exist to deal with what had been a problem and has been continued to be a problem for a long time. He, in fact, shut down the number of beds available. He did not fund HHS to get the children out of those Border Patrol facilities where they should not be and not supposed to be more than a few days, a little while. But he dismantled all of that. And so what we're doing now is attempting to rebuild the system that can accommodate what is happening today. And I'd like to think it's because I'm a nice guy, but it's not. It's because of what's happened every year. Let me say one other thing on this. If you take a look at the number of people who are coming, the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of people coming to the border and crossing are being sent back, Thousands, tens of thousands of people who are over 18 years of age and single people, one at a time coming, have been sent back, sent home. We're sending back the vast majority of the families that are coming. We're trying to work out now with Mexico their willingness to take more of those families back. But that's what's happening. They're not getting across the border. And those who are coming across the border who are unaccompanied children, we're moving rapidly to try to put in place what was dismantled, as I said. For example, of all the children who are coming across the border, over 70% are either 16 or 17 years old. We're not talking about people ripping babies from mother's arms or little 3-year-olds standing on the border. Less than, I think it's 1.5% fall in the category of the very young. So what we're doing is we're providing for the space, again, to be able to get these kids out of the Border Patrol facilities, which no one should be in any longer than 72 hours. And today, I went to, for example, I used all the resources available to me, went to the Defense Department, And the Secretary of Defense has just made available Fort Bliss, 5,000 beds. Be immediately available, 5,000 beds in the Texas border. So we're building back up the capacity that should have been maintained and built upon, that Trump dismantled. It's going to take time. And the other thing we're doing, I might add, am I giving you too long an answer? Because if you don't want the detail. No, but I mean, I don't know how much detail you want about immigration. Maybe I'll stop there and finish.
My follow-up question is, one, if you could talk a little bit about which families, why they're being allowed to stay, what the families that are being allowed to stay, why they're being allowed to stay. And in addition to that, when it comes to the filibuster, which is what Zeke was asking about, there's immigration is a big issue, of course, when it related to the filibuster, but there's also Republicans who are passing bill after bill trying to restrict voting rights. Chuck Schumer is calling it an existential threat to democracy. Why not back a filibuster rule that at least gets around issues including voting rights or immigration? Jim Clyburn, someone, of course, who you know very well, has backed the idea of a filibuster rule when it comes to civil rights and voting rights.
Well, look, I'm going to deal with all of those problems. The question is the priorities as they come and land on my plate. Let's go to the first question you asked, the first of the second questions you asked. And that is, what about dealing with families? Why are not some not going back? Because Mexico is refusing to take them back. They're saying they won't take them back, not all of them. We're in negotiations with the president of Mexico. I think we're going to see that change. They should all be going back, all be going back. The only people we're not going to let sitting there on the other side of the Rio Grande by themselves with no help are children. And what we're doing there, and it's an important point to understand. I know you understand it. I don't mean to say it that way. An important point to focus on. The vast majority of people under the age of 18 come to the United States come with a telephone number on a wristband, or come with a telephone number in their pocket in the United States. A mother, a father, a close relative, a grandmama or grandpa. What was happening before is it's taking literally weeks and weeks and maybe even months before anybody pick up the phone and call to see if there really was someone there. Well, we've set up a system now where within 24 hours there's a phone call made as that child crosses the border. And then a verification system being put in place as of today to determine quickly whether or not that is a trafficker being called or that is actually a mom, a dad, and or a close relative. They're establishing that right off the bat. If it in fact is mom or dad, dad says, to take the extreme case, I got a birth certificate. Then guess what? We're getting that kid directly to that parent immediately. And so that's going to reduce significantly. There's two ways to reduce child populations in circumstances that are not acceptable, like being held at a Border Patrol station. One is to get them to the place where they have a relative and set a date as to when a hearing can be held. The second way to do it is put them in a Health and Human Services facility that we're occupying now, both licensed beds around the country that exist, as well as, for example, federal resources like Fort Bliss, to get them safely in a place where they can be taken care of while their fate is determined. Filibuster. Filibuster. You know, with regard to the filibuster, I believe we should go back to a position of the filibuster that existed just when I came to the United States Senate 120 years ago. And that is that it used to be required for the filibuster, and I had a card on this. I was going to give you the statistics, but you probably know them, that it used to be that from between 1917 and 1971, the filibuster existed. There were a total of 58 motions to break a filibuster. That whole time. Last year alone, there were 5 times that many. So it's being abused in a gigantic way. And for example, It used to be you had to stand there and talk and talk and talk and talk until you collapsed. And guess what? People got tired of talking and tired of collapsing. Filibusters broke down, and we were able to break the filibuster, get a quorum, and vote. So I strongly support moving in that direction, in addition to having an open mind about dealing with certain things that are just elemental to the functioning of our democracy, like the right to vote, like the basic right to vote. We've amended the filibuster in the past. But here's the deal. As you've observed, I'm a fairly practical guy. I want to get things done. I want to get them done consistent with what we promised the American people. And in order to do that, in a 50-50 Senate, we've got to get to the place where I get 50 votes so that the Vice President of the United States can break the tie, or I get 51 votes without her. And so I'm going to say something outrageous. I have never been particularly poor at calculating how to get things done in the United States Senate. So the best way to get something done, if it holds near and dear to you that you like to be able to, anyway, we're going to get a lot done. And if we have to, if there's complete lockdown and chaos as a consequence of the filibuster, then we'll have to go beyond what I'm talking about. Okay, hang on. Sorry. Oh, Ms. Kim.
Thank you, Mr. President. To follow up on the filibuster, so do you believe it should take 60 votes to end a filibuster on legislation or 51?
If we could end it with 51, we would have no problem. You're going to have to, the existing rule, it's going to be hard to get a parliamentary ruling that allows 50 votes to end the filibuster, the existence of a filibuster. It's not my expertise in what the parliamentary rules and how to get there are, but our preoccupation with the filibuster is totally legitimate. But in the meantime, we got a lot we can do while we're talking about what we're going to do about the filibuster. Let me get here. Okay. Cecilia Vega.
I'd like to circle back to immigration, please. You just listed the reasons that people are coming, talking about in-country problems, saying that it happens every year. You blamed the last administration. Sir, I just got back last night from a reporting trip to the border where I met 9-year-old Josel, who walked here from Honduras by himself, along with another little boy. He had that phone number on him, and we were able to call his family. His mother says that she sent her son to this country because she believes that you are not deporting unaccompanied minors like her son. That's why she sent him alone from Honduras. So, sir, you blame the last administration, but is your messaging in saying that these children are and will be allowed to stay in this country and work their way through this process, encouraging families like Josel's to come?
Well, look. The idea that I'm going to say, which I would never do, if an unaccompanied child ends up at the border, we're just going to let him starve to death and stay on the other side. No previous administration did that either, except Trump. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. That's why I've asked the Vice President of the United States yesterday to be the lead person on dealing with focusing on the fundamental reasons why people leave Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador in the first place. It's because of earthquakes, floods. It's because of lack of food. It's because of gang violence. It's because of a whole range of things that when I was vice president had the same obligation to deal with unaccompanied children. I was able to get it slowed up significantly by working with the heads of state of those communities to do things like in one of the major cities, the reason people were leaving is they couldn't walk the street because their kids were getting beat up or shot or gang violence. Well, what I was able to do is not give money to the head of state because so many are corrupt, But I was able to say, okay, you need lighting in the streets to change things? I'll put the lighting in. We got a contractor. We got the type of lighting. We paid directly to the contractor, did not go through the government. And violent crime significantly was reduced in that city. Fewer people sought to leave. When this hurricane occurred, the 2 hurricanes, instead of us going down and helping in a major way so that people would not have a reason to want to leave in the first place because they didn't have housing or water or sustenance, we did nothing. We're going to do a lot in our administration. We're going to be spending that $700+ million a year to change the life and circumstances of why people leave in the first place. That mother did not sit around on the kitchen table and say, you know, I got a great idea. Way I'm going to make sure my son gets taken care of is I'm going to put him, how old was he or she?
He's 9. I also met a 10-year-old.
A 9-year-old. I'm going to send him on a 1,000-mile journey across the desert and up to the United States because I know Joe Biden's a nice guy and he'll take care of him. What a desperate act to have to take. The circumstances must be horrible. So we can do something about that. That's what the Vice President's going to be doing, what I did. When President Obama asked me to come and deal, I was in Turkey at the time. He said, you got to come home and take care of this. So we put together a plan, and it had an impact. And so the question here is how we go ahead and do this, what we do. There's no easy answer.
Quick follow, if I may. Do you want to see these unaccompanied minors staying in this country, or should they be deported eventually?
Well, the judgment has to be made whether or not, in this young man's case, he has a mom at home. There's an overwhelming reason why he'd be put in a plane and flown back to his mom.
Follow, sir. You mentioned circumstances that must be horrific. The Customs and Border Protection Facility in Donna, Texas, I was there, is at 1,556% capacity right now with mostly unaccompanied minors. There are kids that are sleeping on floors. They are packed into these pods. I've spoken to lawyers who say that some of these children have not seen the sun in days. What's your reaction? What is your reaction to these images that have come out from that particular facility? Is what's happening inside acceptable to you? And when is this going to be fixed?
That's a serious question, right? Is it acceptable to me? Come on. That's why we're going to be moving 1,000 of those kids out quickly. That's why I got Fort Bliss opened up. That's why I've been working from the moment this started to happen to try to find additional access for children to be able to safely, not just children, but particularly children, to be able to safely be housed while we follow through on the rest of what's happening. That is totally unacceptable. Ken.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to ask you about Afghanistan. You face a May 1st deadline for the withdrawal of U.S. troops from that country. As a candidate in foreign affairs, you wrote that it is past time to end these forever wars. Can you commit to the American people that by May 2nd, the U.S. will no longer have forces in Afghanistan?
The answer is that it's going to be hard to meet the May 1 deadline. Just in terms of tactical reasons, it's hard to get those troops out. So what we've been doing, what I've been doing, and what Secretary Blinken has been doing has been, we've been meeting with our allies, those other nations that have NATO allies who have troops in Afghanistan as well. And if we leave, we're going to do so in a safe and orderly way. We're in consultation, I say, with our allies and partners and how to proceed. And Secretary Blinken is meeting in Brussels this week with our NATO allies, particularly those who have forces there. And General Austin is just met with Kayani, and I'm waiting for the briefing on that. He is the leader, quote, in Afghanistan and Kabul. And there's a UN-led process that's beginning shortly on how to mechanically get people, how to end this war. But it is not my intention to stay there for a long time. But the question is, how and in what circumstances do we meet that agreement that was made by President Trump to leave under a deal that looks like it's not being able to be worked out to begin with? How's that done? But we are not staying a long time.
You just said if we leave. Do you think it's possible that we
will leave? The question is when we leave.
Do you believe, though, it's possible we could have troops there next year?
I can't picture that being the case. Okay, Kristen.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Given the conditions that were just laid out at the migrant facilities at the U.S. border, will you commit to allowing journalists to have access to the facilities that are overcrowded moving forward?
I will commit when my plan very shortly is underway to let you have access to not just them, but to other facilities as well.
Be able to have access to the facilities. We've obviously been allowed to be inside one, but we haven't seen the facilities in which children are packed together to really give the American people a chance to see that. Will you commit to transparency on this issue?
I will commit to transparency, and as soon as I am in a position to be able to implement what we're doing right now. And one of the reasons I haven't gone down, I have all my chief folks have gone down, is I don't want to become the issue. I don't want to be, bringing all the Secret Service and everybody with me to get in the way. So this is being set up, and you'll have full access to everything once we get this thing moving.
Okay, and just to be clear, how soon will that be, Mr. President?
I don't know, to be clear.
You bear responsibility for everything that's happening at the border now. I hear you talking a lot about the past administration. You decided to roll back some of those policies. Did you move too quickly to
roll back what? I'm sorry?
Policies. Did you move too quickly to roll back some of the executive orders of your predecessor?
First of all the policies that are underway were not helping at all. Did not slow up the amount of immigration and as many people coming. And rolling back the policies of separating children from their mothers, I make no apology for that. Rolling back the policies of remain in Mexico, sitting on the edge of the Rio Grande in a muddy circumstance with not enough to eat, I make no apologies for that. I make no apologies for ending programs that did not exist before Trump became president, that have an incredibly negative impact on the law, international law, as well as on human dignity. And so I make no apologies for that.
To ask you about foreign policy, Mr. President, overnight we learned that North Korea tested 2 ballistic missiles. What, if any, actions will you take, and what is your red line on North Korea?
Let me say that, number one, UN Resolution 1718 was violated by those particular missiles that were tested, number one. We're consulting with our allies and partners, and there will be responses if they choose to escalate. We will respond accordingly. But I'm also prepared for some form of diplomacy, but it has to be conditioned upon the end result of denuclearization. So that's what we're doing right now, consulting with our allies.
Just very quick follow-up.
You only got another hour now, okay?
Diplomacy, can you define what you mean? And former President Obama warned the incoming President Trump that North Korea was the top foreign policy issue that he was watching. Is that how you assess the crisis in North Korea?
Yes. Okay, hang on a second here. Kristen, Nancy, CBS.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to go back to voting rights. And as Yamiche mentioned, Republican legislatures across the country are working to pass bills that would restrict voting, particularly Democrats fear impacting minority voters and young voters, the very people who helped to get you elected in November. Are you worried that if you don't manage to pass voting rights legislation, that your party is going to lose seats and possibly lose control of the House and the Senate in 2022?
What I'm worried about is how un-American this whole initiative is. It's sick. It's sick. Deciding in some states that you cannot bring water to people standing in line, waiting to vote. Deciding that you're going to end voting at 5 o'clock when working people are just getting off work. Deciding that there will be no absentee ballots under the most rigid circumstances. It's all designed, and I'm going to spend my time doing three things. One, trying to figure out how to pass the legislation passed by the House, number one. Number two, educating the American public. The Republican voters I know find this despicable. Republican voters, the folks outside this White House. I'm not talking about the elected officials. I'm talking about voters. And so I'm convinced that we'll be able to stop this because it is the most pernicious thing. This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle. I mean, this is gigantic, what they're trying to do. And it cannot be sustained. And do everything in my power, along with my friends in the House and the Senate, to keep that from becoming the law.
Is there anything else you can do about it besides passing legislation?
The answer is yes, but I'm not going to lay out a strategy in front of the whole world and you now.
And then on a related note, have you decided whether you are going to run for re-election in 2024? You haven't set up a re-election campaign yet, as your predecessor had by this time.
My predecessor needed to. My predecessor. Oh, God, I miss him.
Have you?
No, the answer is yes. My plan is to run for re-election. That's my expectation.
And then on one other note, on bipartisanship, your old friend, Mitch McConnell, says you have only spoken to each other once since you took office, and that you have moved far left since taking office. Do you see it the same way he does? Have you rejected bipartisanship?
No, I haven't at all. I've been meeting. When's the last time a president invited the opposite party down at least a half a dozen times to talk about issues, everything from how we work. We're working with a group of 20 members of the Senate right now and House on how we reestablish our ability to make computer chips, and how we get ahead of the game, how we can work together. We're working together on a bunch of things. But look, I know Mitch well. Mitch knows me well. I would expect Mitch to say exactly what he said. But this is a matter of making sure that I would like elected Republican support. But what I know I have now is I have electoral support from Republican voters. Republican voters agree with what I'm doing. And so unless Mitch says the last thing I did, this last piece of legislation, is so far left, well, then he ought to take a look at his party. Over 50% of them must be over that edge as well, because they support what I did. Okay, where am I here? Let me see. Caitlin?
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I have a question for you, but first, I'd like to follow up on a question from Yamiche, and that's on the filibuster.
That counts as a question, but go ahead.
Okay, I'll make it quick. It's a quick question.
You can.
Regarding the filibuster, at John Lewis's funeral, President Barack Obama said he believed the filibuster was a relic of the Jim Crow era. Do you agree?
Yes.
If not, why not abolish it if it's a relic of the Jim Crow era?
Successful electoral politics is the art of the possible. Let's figure out how we can get this done and move in the direction of significantly changing the abuse of even the filibuster rule first. It's been abused from the time it came into being by an extreme way in the last 20 years. Let's deal with the abuse first.
It sounds like you're moving closer to eliminating the filibuster. Is that correct?
I answered your question.
You also just made some news by saying that you are going to run for re-election.
I said that is my expectation.
So is that a yes, that you are running for re-election?
Look, I don't know where you guys come from, man. I've never been able to travel. I'm a great respecter of fate. I've never been able to plan 3.5 years ahead for certain.
And if you do run, will Vice President Harris be on your ticket?
I would fully expect that to be the case. She's doing a great job. She's a great partner. She's a great partner.
And do you believe you'll be running against former President Trump?
Oh, come on. I don't even think about it. I have no idea. I have no idea whether it'll be a Republican Party. Do you? I know you don't have to answer my question, but I mean, do you? I mean, look, this is the way I view things. I become a great respecter of fate in my life. I set a goal of that's in front of me to get things done for the people I care most about, which are hard-working, decent American people who are really having it stuck to them. I want to change the paradigm. I want to change the paradigm. We start to reward work, not just wealth. I want to change the paradigm. If you notice, didn't you find it kind of interesting that my Republican friends were worried about that the cost and the taxes that had to be had, if there is any tax to be had, as they talk about it, in dealing with the act that we just passed, which puts money in people's pockets, ordinary people? Do you hear them complain when they passed close to $2 trillion Trump tax cut, 83% going to the top 1%? Do you hear them talk about that at all? I love the fact that they found this whole idea of concern about the federal budget. It's kind of amazing. When the federal budget is saving people's lives, they don't think it's such a good idea. When the federal budget is feathering the nest of the wealthiest Americans, 90 of the Fortune 500 companies making billions of dollars, not paying a cent in taxes, reducing taxes to the point that people who are making, if you're a husband and wife, a school teacher, and a cop, you're paying at a higher rate than the average person making $1 billion a year is. Something's wrong. Their newfound concern. I'm concerned. Look, I meant what I said when I ran, and a lot of you still think I'm wrong, and I respect that. So I'm running for 3 reasons. To restore the soul, dignity, honor, honesty, transparency to the American political system. 2, to rebuild the backbone of this country, the middle class, hardworking people and people struggling to get in the middle class. They built America, and unions built them. The 3rd reason I said I was running was to unite the country. And generically speaking, all of you said, no, you can't do that. Well, I've not been able to unite the Congress, but I've been uniting the country based on the polling data. We have to come together. We have to. So from my perspective, it's to me, it's about just, getting out there, putting one foot in front of the other and just trying to make things better for people. Just hard-working people. People get up every morning and just want to figure out how to put food on the table for their kids, be able to have a little bit of breathing room, being able to make sure that they go to bed not staring to the ceiling like my dad did, wondering whether, since he didn't have health insurance, what happens if mom gets sick or he got sick. These are basic things. Basic things. And I'm of the view that the vast majority of people, including registered Republicans by and large, share that same view, that same sense of what is, what's appropriate. Justin Sink, Bloomberg.
Thanks, Mr. President. I wanted to ask about your relationship with China now that you've been in office for a couple months. There's obviously the meeting in Alaska that was a little theatrical, and there's the continued human rights abuses. So today, I'm wondering, are you more likely than you were when you came into office to maintain tariffs on China. Are you considering banning imports of forced labor products? And would you consider cutting off U.S. investment or Chinese access to international payment systems?
Well, look, they're each specifically legitimate questions, but they only touch a smidgen of what the relationship with China really is about. I've known Xi Jinping for a long time. Allegedly, by the time I left office as vice president, I had spent more time with Xi Jinping than any world leader had, because President Obama and the Chinese President Hu decided we should get to know one another, since it was inappropriate for the President of the United States to spend time with the Vice President of another country. But it was obvious he was going to become the new leader of China. So I spent hours upon hours with him alone with an interpreter, my interpreter and his, going into great detail. It's very, very straightforward. Doesn't have a Democratic with a small d bone in his body, but he's a smart guy. He's one of the guys like Putin who thinks that autocracy is the wave of the future. Democracy can't function in an ever complex world. So when I was elected and he called to congratulate me, I think to the surprise of the China experts who were his people on the call as well as mine listening, we had a 2-hour conversation for 2 hours. And we made several things clear to one another. I made it clear to him again, what I've told him in person on several occasions, that we're not looking for confrontation, although we know there will be steep competition. 2, that we'll have strong competition, but we'll insist that China play by the international rules. Fair competition, fair practices, fair trade. Thirdly, in order to compete effectively, I indicated that we're going to deal with China effectively. And we're going to need 3 things to do that, telling our people. First, we're going to invest in American workers and American science. I said that all through the campaign. I say it again, and I'm setting up my administration to be able to do that, which is that, you know, back in the 60s, we used to invest a little over 2% of our entire GDP in pure research and investment in science. Today, it's 0.7%. I'm going to change that. We're going to change that. The future lies in who can, in fact, own the future as it relates to technology, quantum computing, a whole range of things, including in the medical fields. And so what I'm going to do is make sure we invest closer to 2%. One of the reasons why I've set up the PAB, the President's Board with Scientists and the like, again, is we're going to invest in medical research, cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, the things, industries of the future, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotech, and we're going to make real investments. China is out investing us by a long shot because their plan is to own that future. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to reestablish our alliances, and I've been very clear with them. It's not anti-Chinese, and we've talked about it. I want to make sure that, for example, later today, after this, as a matter of fact, shortly after this, which is fine, we've been going close to an hour. I'm happy to go longer, but one of the things that I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be speaking with 27 heads of state in Europe. And very shortly, I think within the next hour or so, I don't know the exact time. And earlier this month, and apparently it got the Chinese attention, that's not why I did it, I met with our allies and how we're going to hold China accountable in the region. Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, the so-called Quad. Because we have to have democracies working together. Before too long, I'm going to have I'm going to invite an alliance of democracies to come here to discuss the future. And so we're going to make it clear that in order to deal with these things, we are going to hold China accountable to follow the rules. To follow the rules, whether it relates to the South China Sea or the North China Sea or the agreement made on Taiwan or a whole range of other things. And the third thing, and the thing that I admire about dealing with Xi, is he understands. He makes no pretense about not understanding what I'm saying any more than I do him. I pointed out to him, no leader can be sustained in his position or her position unless they represent the values of the country. And I said, Mr. President, as I've told you before, Americans value the notion of freedom. America values human rights. We don't always live up to our expectations, but it's a value system. We are founded on that principle. And as long as you and your country continues to so blatantly violate human rights, we are going to continue in an unrelenting way to call to the attention of the world and make it clear what's happening. And he understood that. I made it clear that no American president, at least one did, but no American president ever backed down from speaking out of what's happening in the Uyghurs, what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening in country. That's who we are. The moment a president walks away from that, as the last one did, is the moment we begin to lose our legitimacy around the world. It's who we are. So I see stiff competition with China. China has an overall goal, and I don't criticize them for the goal, but they have an overall goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. That's not going to happen on my watch, because the United States is going to continue to grow and expand.
All right, just to follow up on the meeting of democracies, is that where you expect in a multilateral way to make these decisions about sanctions or
No, that's not where I make the decision. That's where I make sure we're all on the same page. All on the same page. Look, I predict to you, your children or grandchildren are going to be doing their doctoral thesis on issue of who succeeded, autocracy or democracy, because that is what is at stake. Not just with China. Look around the world. We're in the midst of a fourth industrial revolution of enormous consequence. Will there be middle class? How will people adjust to these significant changes in science and technology, the environment? How will they do that? And our democracy is equipped, because all the people get to speak, to compete. It is clear, absolutely clear, and most of the scholars I dealt with at Penn agree with me around the country, that this is a battle between the utility of democracies in the 21st century and autocracies. If you notice, you don't have Russia talking about communism anymore. It's about an autocracy. Demand decisions made by a leader of a country. That's what's at stake here. We got to prove democracy works.
Mr. President, sorry, I know you haven't had a chance to address the tragedies in Georgia and Colorado. You had said to stay tuned for actions that you might take on gun control. Wondering if you've made a decision either about sending the manufacturer liability bill that you had promised on day one to Capitol Hill, or executive actions like going after ghost guns or giving money to cities and states to battle gun control.
All the above. It's a matter of timing. As you've all observed, successful presidents, better than me, have been successful in large part because they know how to time what they're doing, order it, decide on priorities, what needs to be done. The next major initiative is, and I'll be announcing it Friday in Pittsburgh in detail, is to rebuild the infrastructure, both physical and technological infrastructure of this country, so that we can compete and create significant numbers of really good paying jobs. Really good paying jobs. And some of you have been around long enough to know that used to be a great Republican goal and initiative. I still think the majority of the American people don't like the fact that we are now ranked, what, 85th in the world in infrastructure? I mean, look, the future rests on whether or not we have the best airports that can accommodate air travel, ports that you can get in and out of quickly, so businesses decide. Some of you, if you're ever local reporters and you found your governor or mayor trying to attract business to your community, what's the first thing the business asked? What's the closest access to an interstate highway? How far am I from freight rail? Is the water available? Is enough water available for me to conduct my business? All the things that relate to infrastructure. We have somewhere, I asked the staff to write it down for me, and they did, not for this, but for a longer discussion. We have somewhere in terms of infrastructure, we rank 13th globally in infrastructure. China is investing 3 times more in infrastructure than the United States is. Bridges, more than 1/3 of our bridges, 231,000 of them, need repairs. Some are physical safety risks or preservation work. 1 in 5 miles of our highways and major roads are in poor condition. That's 186,000 miles of highway. Aviation, 20% of all flights weren't on time, resulting in 1.5 million hours lost in production. 6 to 10 million homes in America still have lead pipes servicing their water lines. We have over 100,000 wellheads that are not capped, leaking methane. What are we doing? And by the way, we can put as many pipe fitters and miners on us to work capping those wells at the same price that they would charge to dig those wells. So I just find it frustrating. You talk about, last point I'll make in the infrastructure, and I apologize for spending more time on it, but is that if you think about it, it's the place where we will be able to significantly increase American productivity, at the same time providing really good jobs for people. But we can't build back to what they used to be. We have to build, the global warming's already done significant damage. The roads that used to be above the water level didn't have to worry about where the drainage ditch was. Now you got to rebuild them 3 feet higher, because it's not going to go back to what it was before, only get worse unless we stop it. There's so much we can do. Look at all the schools in America. Most of you live in the Washington area now, but in your hometowns, I don't know where you're all from. How many schools where the kids can't drink the water out of the fountain? How many schools are still in a position where there's asbestos? How many schools in America we're sending our kids to don't have adequate ventilation? How many homes, buildings, office complexes are wasting billions of barrels of oil over time because they can't hold in the heat or the air conditioning because it leaks through the windows that are so porous in the connections? It's amazing. So there's so much we can do that's good stuff, makes people healthier, and creates good jobs. And I think that I got one more question here. And Janet from Univision.
Thank you, Mr. President. We too have been reporting at the border, and just like Cecilia, we ran into a pair of siblings who came in on Monday, were detained by CBP, had the phone number for their mother who lives in the U.S. We have contacted the mother. That's the only way they know her kids are here, because CBP today, Thursday, has not contacted that mother. So when can we expect your promise of things getting better with contacting and expediting?
Well, they're already getting better, but they're going to get real. They're going to a whole hell of a lot better real quick, or we're going to hear some people leaving. Okay? We can get this done. We're going to get it done. I had a long meeting with the entire team and several cabinet-level officers the other night. We're going to be moving within the next week over 100,000. I mean, 1,000 people out of the Border Patrol into safe, secure beds and facilities. We're going to significantly ramp up. We're already out there contacting everyone from getting some of the employees at HHS. There's a lot of them doing other things and move them into making those calls. We're in the process of rearranging and providing for the personnel needed to get that done. But I admire the fact that you were down there, you're making the calls yourself. It's real. The next thing that has to happen, though, as you well know, has to happen. There have to be some certitude that this is actually mom, dad, or whomever. And there's ways to do that. There's ways to do that, a little bit like determining whether or not you got the right code for your credit card. You know, what was your dog's name, kind of thing. I'm being a bit facetious, but not really. And also seeking harder data from DNA to birth certificates, which takes longer. So I want to do this as quickly, as humanly possible, and as safely as possible.
As you well know, treating the root causes in Latin America doesn't change things overnight. How do you realistically and physically keep these families from coming to the U.S. when things will not get better in their countries right away?
Well, I can't guarantee that, but I know, you know, that old thing, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with the first step. You know as well as I do. You cover it. You have serious. It's not like somebody sitting on a hand-hewn table in Guatemala. I mean, in somewhere in Mexico or in Guadalupe, saying, "I got a great idea. Let's sell everything we have, give it to a coyote, have them take our kids across the border into a desert where they don't speak the language. Won't that be fun? Let's go." That's not how it happens. People don't want to leave. When my great-grandfather got in a coffin ship in the Irish Sea, the expectation was he going to live long enough on that ship to get to the United States of America. But they left because of what the Brits had been doing. They were in real trouble. They didn't want to leave, but they had no choice. So I can't guarantee we're going to solve everything, but I can guarantee we can make everything better. We can make it better. We can change the lives of so many people. And the other thing I want to point out to you, and I hope you point out, I realize it's much more heart-wrenching, and it is, to deal with a 5-, and 6-, and 7-year-old. But you went down there and you saw the vast majority of these children, 70% are 16 years old, 17 years old, and mostly males. Doesn't make it good, bad, or indifferent, but the idea that we have tens of thousands of kids in these god-awful facilities that are really little babies crying all night, there's some, that's true. That's why we got to act. And yesterday, I asked my team, both the director of the two agencies as well as others, I asked them what would they in fact, and I asked their opinion because they're the experts, but I said, focus on the most vulnerable immediately. But there's no reason why in the next month as people cross the border, that phone call can't be made in the first 48 hours and begin.
If I may ask one last question. Have you had any talks with Senate Republicans who are threatening this administration with not considering the immigration legislation that was passed in the House until the situation at the border has been resolved?
No, because I know they have to posture for a while. They sort of got to get it out of their system. This is but I'm ready to work with any Republican who wants to help solve the problem or make the situation better. But folks, I'm going. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And we've been listening to President Biden hold his first formal news conference. You just saw him exit there to a chorus of questions still being shouted out to him. This comes on the president's 65th day in office. President Biden was asked about immigration policy, gun control, climate change, his view of the filibuster, voting rights, as well as a range of foreign policy issues. So let's dive right in. We are joined by CBSN political reporter Caitlin Huey-Burns, CBS News congressional correspondent Nicole Killian, CBS News political analyst and Republican strategist Leslie Sanchez, and CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist Joel Payne. Welcome to all of you. Caitlin, let me start with you. A lot to unpack here. The president certainly made news by saying his intention is to run again in 2024. Kind of, sort of. Overall, what are your initial thoughts to this first official press conference?
That's right, making some news there by a question from our own Nancy Cordes asking if he would run for re-election in 2024. He started off this press conference by talking about the pandemic, coronavirus, the vaccine, saying that his goal is 200 million shots in the first 100 days, a revision from the original goal of 100 million shots in the first 100 days. But the press conference was not focused on the pandemic or the vaccine. Instead, it was focused on these other issues that have really come to the forefront in the past couple of weeks. The issue of immigration being chief among them. This is a growing issue for this administration, given the surge of migrants at the border. When asked about it, Biden said that it is important to address the root causes, addressing why migrants are coming. And he also argued that it was something that is happening every year, that it was seasonal. But we also know that needs a little bit of fact checking, because his own DHS secretary said last week that the amount of individuals at the border is the most that they've seen in 20 years. And there also are still remaining questions about how to address this issue now. Yes, addressing the root causes is important, but how do you address the overflow that's happening now? He also was asked about the filibuster, and the reason that he's being asked about the filibuster is because his agenda depends on whether Congress can actually get anything passed. And at this point, big ambitious plans on climate change, on guns, on voting rights, infrastructure, which he talked about at length later on, all depend on getting 60 votes in the Senate. And as we know, that is extremely elusive on legislation. So while Biden doesn't have the power to change the filibuster rules unilaterally, he is being asked about it because it involves his priorities. And he said that he is open to some changes.
Open to some changes, indeed. Didn't come out strongly against it, though. Nicole, what was your overall reaction to the press conference? What stood out to you?
Well, I think from the perspective of covering Capitol Hill, I think, as we discussed going into the press conference, is this issue of bipartisanship, which you also heard Nancy Cordes raise as to whether or not he rejects bipartisanship, since it's something that he really has hung his hat on, that is something that he takes pride in doing and reaching across the aisle. And, I think you really saw him kind of walk the line there, because on one hand, towards the end of the press conference, you heard him talk about he's willing to work with, any many Republicans who want to work on this issue of immigration and on other matters, whether it's infrastructure. He did also say at a point in the press conference that he's practical and that he realizes that in order to get things done, he needs 50 votes, basically 51 with a tie break from the vice president. So I think that was a very clear indication of his strategy, which is the strategy that we saw employed with the American Rescue Plan, the fact that that went through this budget process of reconciliation where it did not necessarily require Republican support. It was something where Democrats could pass that on their own. There is talk potentially that strategy could be used again for this big infrastructure plan that could be coming down the pike. So I think, he made clear when it comes to getting things done, if he has to go to that simple majority, he will. But on the same token, he did emphasize that, while he may not be able to unite Congress, he feels he has been able to unite the country. And he made that distinction of saying that he believes he has support of Republican voters, even if he doesn't necessarily have the support of Republicans in Congress. And that continues to be a distinction that we have heard not just from the White House, but also from Democratic members of Congress. So I think that is a thread to watch going forward as far as this next big plan that he puts forth, which is expected as soon as next week.
All right, Nicole Killian, thank you so much. I know you have to dash. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Joel, let me turn to you now. There was a lot of time spent on the situation at the southern border. I do think the president was able to make some solid points about how thorny and difficult this problem is to fix because, of course, you have to address the source, which he says his administration is doing. He outlined some of the ways that the administration is doing that. But, of course, as most reporters there noted, this will take time. In terms of the immediate response to the situation at the border, what did the president outline he was planning to do? And do you think that this administration will not be given the luxury of that time to deal with what's happening at the border?
A lot to unpack here, Tanya. The first thing I noticed is something that Caitlin mentioned was that the president started with this, big announcement about coronavirus, and none of the reporters there, including our own Nancy Cordes and others, decided to follow up on really anything related to coronavirus. I think reflects maybe some optimism within the country about vaccine distribution, about the president and his response to COVID. And I think that is probably something that, while it might not feel like it at this moment, the Biden team can maybe feeling good about it might be the wrong term, but they can feel some satisfaction that it's clear that the press corps has moved on. And that's reflective of the country. To your question about immigration, however, I think this is an obvious, clear and present, crisis moment for the administration. I know there's been consternation about whether the term crisis is appropriate to use, but obviously there's been a lot of attention. It's heightened public awareness within the last few weeks. I think the president has been pretty clear about his values, that he's not going to make apologies for rolling back some of those Trump-era edicts and mandates related to child separation, et cetera, but that he understands that there is an issue to deal with here. He talked about the value of not wanting these young people to be in these facilities for too long, to being clear with those who are seeking to send their children across the border that they should not do that. I think the president has done everything you could ask him to do in terms of public messaging. I think obviously the execution becomes a challenge. They have executed well on coronavirus vaccine distribution, on managing that crisis. This is a new crisis that I imagine the president and his team will now look to wrap their arms around. Last thing I'll say, I thought that the back and forth about the filibuster was really interesting. I know Caitlin noted it on her Twitter feed that was a real kind of watershed moment. That's the furthest we've heard Joe Biden go on the filibuster. He's obviously talked about the talking filibuster before, but he acknowledged it was essentially kind of a threat without a lot of teeth behind it. But it was a threat that if you can't get things done that mean something to the American people, that he would be willing to go further. Last thing, I promise. I'm sorry, Tanya. It reminded me a little bit also of Barack Obama in this way. Barack Obama, I remember on that campaign trail in 2008, talked a lot about Obamacans, these Republicans that Barack Obama counted as his supporters. And I thought it was so interesting that President Biden has really driven a wedge between Republicans in Washington and Republicans around the country, that broadly support his agenda, even if the Mitch McConnells and folks on Capitol Hill, those Republicans on Capitol Hill, Kevin McCarthy, et cetera, if they don't support the president. And so I thought that was an interesting tactic that we saw the president employ as well.
Absolutely. And Joel, never apologize. We always love your insights, no matter how long they go. So thank you. Leslie, I want to have you weigh in on how you think Republicans will respond to this press conference.
Tremendous amount of pushback is going to be from Republicans. I think you've already seen and heard that. Senator Ted Cruz, on the issue of the border, took a delegation of 17 members down there to see firsthand what the situation is like. And they talk about the lack of media transparency, the lack of seeing the actual conditions these children are living in. And that pressure from Republicans is why you've seen this dramatic pushback by the Biden administration. Talking the news today, 5,000 beds at Fort Bliss. I have been to Fort Bliss. I've covered the U.S.-Mexico border for 20 years. I will tell you that it's the irony is steep when you talk about, oh, it's something that's going to be managed by HHS in terms of the care of these facilities, but using Department of Defense resources, let's say logistic or whatever it is, for 5,000 beds as the Biden administration is a temporary solution. Had the Trump administration said that, any use of DOD resources came with tremendous criticism, and you don't see anything here. I think Lindsey Graham also came forward and said he called it a virtual human tsunami that has happened in the Biden administration. The numbers prove that to be the case, but I'd call it a human trafficking tsunami. No one is addressing with real clarity what is happening, the abuses across the line of these children, and these kind of Band-Aid approaches and trying to find safe havens, temporary safe havens, and how weakly it was understood, the weak message, I would say, that these families, these children, in many cases, if their mother or he said mother particularly, are in Latin America, that they will, or Central America, they will be returned. That probably makes the most sense. There is a push-pull with our southern border, and there has been for half a century. And the policies that we have in the United States of really attracting and opening the gates, so to speak, where it's a worthwhile risk, that's a very dangerous game. And I think that's right in the middle of where the Biden administration is. So Joel's right, unpacking that. This border crisis, especially after what I heard today, is going to be a more dramatic crisis because the signals are mixed, and there's a lot of sympathy in Mexico for kind of opening and allowing the migrants to pass through. That is not going to be corrected. It has never been corrected with a soft touch. It really has to be a strong U.S. stand on border security and coming up with a solution that works.
All right, let's bring in now CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe. Ed, a lot of time was spent on the border and immigration policy, but let's get to gun control. As you know, there have been 2 high-profile mass shootings recently. There's the ongoing debate between Democrats and Republicans over how to handle gun control in America. Unfortunately, for so many Americans, this story is ringing all too familiar. But Ed, did the president address gun control head on today?
No, he didn't, and he acknowledged that it's because of timing. The point he made is that, look, successful presidents lay things out, try to get them done at certain points in their presidency. This is a well-organized, carefully orchestrated administration that is focused right now on the economic relief and the economic recovery. That the next big mission, as he pointed out there, and a lengthy question about gun control resulted in a lengthy answer about infrastructure spending and why it's needed. The point that he was trying to make is that is something we'll get to, addressing gun violence in this country. But for now, the urgent focus for him, for his administration, for Democrats on Capitol Hill, is sorting out how to pay for and how to make big changes in the nation's infrastructure. Look, we've spent plenty of time discussing the fact that every time one of these shootings happens, eyes turn to the White House and the Capitol to see what could possibly be done. He knows as well as anyone that right now, at this exact moment, something that can't necessarily get done. If he signals, if congressional Democrats signal that they're getting serious about it and they can have conversations about it, then at some point we may see some action, but it's not coming right now. There's a big understanding here in Washington that that infrastructure spending bill that he wants to do, which could be quite large, could be more focused. We're still waiting for results that he will, or for plans that he will unveil next Wednesday, is going to be the next sort of big thing that has to happen while there are concurrent conversations about voting rights, as you saw him talk about under questioning from Nancy Cortez, about climate change, about immigration, and yes, about gun control as well. He's been a part of those conversations in the past and is, arguably well equipped to understand that dropping everything and focusing on that right now would be a fruitless exercise, as crass as that may be.
And Ed, what are your thoughts on what the president was signaling in terms of his feelings about the filibuster?
Well, I mean, I think his attitude is, look, he doesn't rule out the possibility that if Republicans remain intransigent and unwilling to work with him, that, yeah, at some point it may be needed. But he's served in the Senate and he has served in Washington long enough to know that the shoe on your left foot today could be on your right one tomorrow, and the situation could be reversed. I think he and several other members of his party are trying to signal to Democrats and to his supporters and to those who want to see it abolished that this could be turned around and used by Republicans or by a conservative government later on. And so, he doesn't necessarily want to go there just yet. And let's be honest, let's be frank. All the Senate has done this year is pass a multi-trillion-dollar piece of legislation under budget rules that allowed for a simple majority vote and confirmed dozens of Biden administration officials. There has yet to be a legislative-focused debate in the Senate that has led to a Republican throwing up the filibuster rule. Unless or until we get to that point, in his view, this is an academic conversation. The question will be when they get back from the Easter recess. What do Democrats in the Senate want to work on first? Do they take up this infrastructure bill? Do they put the voting rights bill on the floor? Do they take up the immigration legislation that the House passed or the gun control legislation? That's a calculation that the White House and Chuck Schumer are taking, and we'll hear more about it in the coming weeks. But unless or until a filibuster is thrown up, this president, for now, is talking more theoretically about it and doesn't necessarily see the need to do it. He made a point there early on. He says, I'm well equipped to understand what it takes to get a deal done in the Senate. That is true. He was there a long time. He hasn't worked with most of the senators that are there now, but he understands how you can get something done. And let's see here in the coming weeks if he figures out ways to do that that avoid having to take that step in removing the filibuster.
All right. Well, Ed O'Keefe, we know you have to dash. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Caitlin, I want to turn back to you and ask you about the president's comments around voting rights. He got very incensed about some of the legislation that certain southern states are considering passing. And, there were moments, there were fiery moments from the president, and that was one of them. Can you give us some insight into that?
That's right. Well, our Nancy Cortez had asked if he was worried about the party losing seats if they're not able to pass voting rights legislation. And what he said he's worried about is, quote, how un-American this whole initiative is. And he's talking about the efforts underway in state legislatures to curb access to the vote. We've seen Iowa already pass and sign into law a measure that would cut back on the number of early voting days and the hours of voting. Georgia right now today is debating a final bill that could become law as soon as later this week or maybe next week to cut back on or to add some voting restrictions, even though it looks like this version of the bill being considered isn't as extreme as some of the original proposals. But the reason that it is being posed to this question is being posed to President Biden is because this is an issue that is really animating the base of the Democratic Party, and opposition to voting rights legislation and H.R. 1 S1 being considered now by the Senate is a key animating force among the base of the Republican Party. So this is an issue that we've reported on a lot over the past several months, and talking to activists who are advocating for voting rights legislation, they say that they're focusing now on the filibuster because they can't get anything passed on this from a federal perspective without getting rid of that rule that requires 60 votes to continue. So that's kind of where that debate has been centered. He was also notably asked if he agreed with former President Obama, who last year at the funeral for John Lewis, giving his eulogy there, said that the filibuster should be abolished to be able to pass voting rights. And he called the filibuster a relic of Jim Crow. Biden was asked today, does he think it's a relic of Jim Crow? And he said, yes. So then he was asked, well, why not abolish it? And he said, successful electoral politics is the art of the possible. Let's figure out how to get things done. Let's deal with the abuse of the filibuster itself. So not going as far, but voting rights activists that we've spoken to say they're focused on the filibuster because the filibuster had been used traditionally to stymie civil rights legislation. But Republicans are arguing that, look, what Democrats are trying to pass in terms of H.R. 1S1 is a federal takeover of state-run elections, and that it would create some big burdens for state and local officials, which is true. It would create some big hurdles for them to implement some of these changes. And they also argued yesterday in a hearing that not all of the bills being talked about across the country are actually making their way through into law. Democrats, however, say that there needs to be federal legislation because of everything that's going on in the states. They want to be able to create same-day voter registration, expand vote by mail, and they think this is an issue that in terms of their base is front and center. And just the last thing I'll say is that, you know, the focus on this, Democrats who are supportive of abolishing the filibuster kind of feel like they don't have much to lose at this point because their base really wants them to get something done. And if they can't deliver on the agenda that they promised because the filibuster is getting in the way, Jeff Merkley, who is a senator who has been advocating for filibuster reform, told me last week that he's worried that Democrats will lose seats in the House and the Senate because their voters won't show up because they'll wonder, why didn't you get anything done because of these rules? So those are kind of the background dynamics at play. But as Ed mentioned, there is a very, very long way to go in terms of filibuster reform, and we'll see if this issue is something that becomes an issue in the 2022 midterms.
Legislation instantly pivots to questions about the filibuster. All right, well, we could continue on with, diving into what the president said for hours, but we've run out of time. Caitlin Huey-Burns, Leslie Sanchez, and Joel Payne, thanks so much for joining us. The U.S. Department of Labor is reporting the lowest number of new unemployment claims since the coronavirus pandemic began. 684,000 people requested unemployment benefits last week. That is a decrease of 97,000 from the week before. President Biden addressed the economy during his first official press conference earlier today. And while he approved of the progress made so far, he made it clear there's a lot of work still to be done.
It's the first time in a year the number has fallen below the pre-pandemic high. So there are still too many Americans out of work, too many families hurting, and they still have a lot of work to do. But I can say to you, the American people, help is here and hope is on the way.
Joining me now is Lori Bettinger. Lori is the co-president of Bank Alliance. She's also the former director of the Troubled Asset Relief Program during the Obama administration. Lori, welcome. Thank you for being with us. What does this low number of new unemployment claims tell you about the state of the economy and where we're heading?
Well, I have to say it's good to see the trend moving in the right direction. But when you look at the number itself, it's not that low. It just feels low after a year of, really terrible numbers. And so I'm so glad, as I think everyone is, to see this, unemployment trends. It feels like we're seeing, less new claims, but the number itself is still pretty high, particularly in a historical perspective. And those are still people and families and communities being affected. So the way I see it is, we're seeing businesses pullback on the layoffs, but it's not as though we're starting to see a huge hiring bump yet. I think that a lot of companies are still in a bit of a wait and see mode to see, hey, is this it? Are we really, starting to turn? Is this, the it of the COVID shutdowns? Or are there more to come? And should we, only hire a few people here and there, but not really plan for additional growth?
And Lori, in his press conference, we heard the president take some credit for the improvement of the economy. How much do you think that President Biden's American Rescue Plan is playing into the number of jobless claims filed?
Well, I think it's probably too early to be able to directly tie the American Rescue Plan to sort of the diminishment of the unemployment numbers. I mean, we're just starting, right? We've seen some of the initial direct consumer support go into place. But I think it'll be interesting over the next weeks and months. Do businesses feel like they have that certainty to start hiring? Do small businesses feel like, they can really get their feet under them and, maybe rehire some people that in some cases they laid off, they hired, and they had to lay off again, which I think is a process that no one really wants to go through. So I think, the great thing about the rescue plan, which just passed, is that the good news is you can see that, we're going directly to consumers, whether it's the stimulus check, whether it's the additional unemployment benefits, those are all direct helps. But in terms of hiring, I'm not sure you can see that direct effect yet, because clearly PPP has been going for some time. And I think that, both rounds 1 and 2 have had a really strong impact on it, reducing unemployment.
Right. So, Lori, as you pointed out, despite the downward trend, there's still a very large number of people who are without jobs. President Biden wants to focus on adding jobs by focusing on infrastructure, which he indicated is going to be one of his next things to focus on. How much of an impact can the upcoming infrastructure bill or the big Build Back Better plan have on unemployment if it passes?
I think that could have a real direct impact on employment because, when the president talked about the scale of some of these plans and, the magnitude and sort of good, well-paying jobs, I mean, then you could really see, I think, a sustained recovery in the labor markets, not just sort of a little bit in this sector, a little bit in that sector. If you can really implement that plan and get these projects started sooner rather than later and do them, effectively, I think we really could start to see the employment figures improve in a way that's sustainable, which would be, I think, very exciting for everyone to see.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Lori Bettinger, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time and your insight.
Thank you.
We're going to take a short break, but this is a good time to remind you can stay up to date by downloading our CBS News app. Stay with us. You're streaming CBSN, CBS News, always on.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy. And reach for the stars.
Here we are.
Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more. Experience thought-provoking.
Welcome to the idea of being a human being.
Innovative and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.